Chapter 4. I did not faint, but the effort to realise my position made me very giddy, and I remember that my companion had to give me a strong arm as he conducted me from the roof to a roomy apartment on the upper floor of the house, where he insisted on my drinking a glass or two of good wine and partaking of a light repast. "I think you are going to be all right now," he said cheerily. "I should not have taken you so abrupt a means to convince you of your position if your course, while perfectly excusable under the circumstances, had not rather obliged me to do so, I confess." He added, laughing, "I was a little apprehensive at one time that I should undergo what I believe you used to call a knock-down in the 19th century, if I did not act rather promptly. I remembered that the Bostonians of your day were famous pugilists, and thought best to lose no time. I take it you're now ready to acquit me of the charge of hoaxing you." "If you had told me," I replied, profoundly awed, "that 1,000 years instead of 100 had elapsed since I last looked on this city, I should now believe you." "Only a century has passed," he answered, "but many a millennium in the world's history has seen changes less extraordinary. And now," he added, extending his hand with an air of irresistible cordiality, "let me give you a hearty welcome to the Boston of the 20th century, and to this house. My name is Leet, Dr. Leet, they call me." "My name," I said as I shook his hand, "is Julian West." "I'm most happy in making your acquaintance, Mr. West," he responded. "Seeing that this house is built on the site of your own, I hope you'll find it easy to make yourself at home in it." After my refreshment, Dr. Leet offered me a bath and a change of clothing, of which I gladly availed myself. It did not appear that any very startling revolution in men's attire had been among the great changes my host had spoken of, for, barring a few details, my new habiliments did not puzzle me at all. Physically, I was now myself again, but mentally, how was it with me? The reader will doubtless wonder. What were my intellectual sensations, he may wish to know, on finding myself so suddenly dropped, as it were, into a new world? In reply, let me ask him to suppose himself suddenly, in the twinkling of an eye, transported from earth, say, to paradise or Hades. What does he fancy would be his own experience? Would his thoughts return at once to the earth he had just left, or would he, after the first shock, willing forget his former life for a while, albeit to be remembered later, in the interest excited by his new surroundings? All I can say is that if his experience were at all like mine in the transition I'm describing, the latter hypothesis would prove the correct one. The impressions of amazement and curiosity which my new surroundings produced occupied my mind after the first shock, to the exclusion of all other thoughts. For the time, the memory of my former life was, as it were, in abeyance. No sooner did I find myself physically rehabilitated through the kind offices of my host than I became eager to return to the housetop, and presently we were comfortably established there in easy chairs, with the city beneath and around us. After Dr. Leet had responded to numerous questions on my part as to the ancient landmarks I missed and the new ones which had replaced them, he asked me what point of contrast between the new and the old city struck me most forcibly. To speak of small things before great, I responded, "I really think that the complete absence of chimneys and their smoke is the detail that first impressed me." "Ah," ejaculated my companion with an air of much interest, "I'd forgotten the chimneys. It is so long since they went out of use. It's nearly a century since the crude method of combustion on which you depend for heat became obsolete." "In general," I said, "what impresses me most about the city is the material prosperity on the part of the people which its magnificence implies. I would give a great deal for just one glimpse of the Boston of your day, replied Dr. Leet. No doubt, as you imply, the cities of that period were rather shabby affairs. If you had the taste to make them splendid, which I would not be so rude as to question, the general poverty resulting from your extraordinary industrial system would not have given you the means. Moreover, the excessive individualism which then prevailed was inconsistent with much public spirit. What little wealth you had seems almost wholly to have been lavished in private luxury. Nowadays, on the contrary, there is no destination of the surplus wealth so popular as the adornment of the city, which all enjoy in equal degree. The sun had been setting as we returned to the housetop, and as we talked, night descended upon the city. "It's growing dark," said Dr. Leet. "Let us descend into the house. I want to introduce my wife and daughter to you." His words recalled to me the feminine voices which I had heard whispering about me as I was coming back to conscious life, and most curious to learn what the ladies of the year 2000 were like. I assented with alacrity to the proposition. The apartment in which we found the wife and daughter of my host, as well as the entire interior of the house, was filled with a mellow light, which I knew must be artificial, although I could not discover the source from which it was diffused. Mrs. Leet was an exceptionally fine-looking and well-preserved woman of about her husband's age, while the daughter, who was in the first blush of womanhood, was the most beautiful girl I'd ever seen. Her face was as bewitching as deep blue eyes, delicately tinted complexion, and perfect features could make it. But even had her countenance lacked special charms, the faultless luxuriance of her figure would have given her place as a beauty among the women of the 19th century. Feminine softness and delicacy were in this lovely creature deliciously combined with an appearance of health and abounding physical vitality, too often lacking in the maidens with whom alone I could compare her. It was a coincidence, trifling in comparison with the general strangeness of the situation, but still striking, that her name should be Edith. The evening that followed was certainly unique in the history of social intercourse, but to suppose that our conversation was peculiarly strained or difficult would be a great mistake. I believe, indeed, that it is under what may be called unnatural in the sense of extraordinary circumstances that people behave most naturally, for the reason, no doubt, that such circumstances banish artificiality. I know at any rate that my intercourse that evening with these representatives of another age and world was marked by an ingenious sincerity and frankness, such as but rarely crown long acquaintance. No doubt the exquisite tact of my entertainers had much to do with this. Of course, there was nothing we could talk of but the strange experience by virtue of which I was there, but they talked of it with an interest so naive and direct in its expression as to relieve the subject of a great degree of the element of the weird and the uncanny, which might so easily have been overpowering. One would have supposed that they were quite in the habit of entertaining waifs from another century, so perfect was their tact. For my own part, never do I remember the operations of my mind to have been more alert and acute than that evening, or my intellectual sensibilities more keen. Of course, I do not mean that the consciousness of my amazing situation was for a moment out of mind, but its chief effect, thus far, was to produce a feverish elation, a sort of mental intoxication. Edith Leet took little part in the conversation, but when several times the magnetism of her beauty drew my glance to her face, I found her eyes fixed on me with an absorbed intensity, almost like fascination. It was evident that I had excited her interest to an extraordinary degree, as was not astonishing, supposing her to be a girl of imagination. Though I supposed curiosity was the chief motive of her interest, it could but affect me as it would not have done had she been less beautiful. Dr. Leet, as well as the ladies, seemed greatly interested in my account of the circumstances under which I had gone to sleep in the underground chamber. All had suggestions to offer to account for my having been forgotten there, and the theory which we finally agreed on offers at least a plausible explanation, although whether it be in its details the true one, nobody of course will ever know. The layer of ashes found above the chamber indicated that the home had been burned down. Let it be supposed that the configuration had taken place the night I fell asleep. It only remains to assume that Sawyer lost his life in the fire, or by some accident connected with it, and the rest follows naturally enough. No one but he and Dr. Pillsbury either knew of the existence of the chamber, or that I was in it, and Dr. Pillsbury, who had gone that night to New Orleans, had probably never heard of the fire at all. The conclusion of my friends and of the public must have been that I had perished in the flames. An excavation of the ruins, unless thorough, would not have disclosed the recess in the foundation walls connecting with my chamber. To be sure, if the site had been again built upon, at least immediately, such an excavation would have been necessary. But the troublous times and the undesirable character of the locality might well have prevented rebuilding. The size of the trees in the garden now occupying the site indicated, Dr. Leet said, that for more than half a century at least it had been an open ground. When in the course of the evening the ladies retired, leaving Dr. Leet and myself alone, he sounded me as to my disposition for sleep, saying that if I felt like it, my bed was ready for me, but if I was inclined to wakefulness, nothing would please him better than to bear me company. I am a late bird myself, he said, and without suspicion of flattery, I may say that a companion more interesting than yourself could scarcely be imagined. It is decidedly not often that one has a chance to converse with a man of the 19th century. Now, I had been looking forward all the evening with some dread to the time when I should be alone on retiring for the night, surrounded by these most friendly strangers, stimulated and supported by their sympathetic interest. I'd been able to keep my mental balance. Even then, however, in pauses of the conversation, I had had glimpses, vivid as lightning flashes, of the horror of strangeness that was waiting to be faced when I could no longer command diversion. I knew I could not sleep that night, and as for lying awake and thinking, it argues no cowardice. I am sure to confess that I was afraid of it. When in reply to my host's question, I frankly told him this, he replied that it would be strange if I did not feel just so, but that I need to have no anxiety about sleeping. Whenever I wanted to go to bed, he would give me a dose which would ensure me a sound night's sleep without fail. Next morning, no doubt, I would awake with the feelings of an old citizen. Before I acquire that, I replied, I must know a little more about the sort of Boston I've come back to. You told me when we were upon the housetop that, though a century only had elapsed since I fell asleep, it had been marked by greater changes in the conditions of humanity than many a previous millennium. With the city before me, I could well believe that, but I'm very curious to know what some of these changes have been. To make a beginning somewhere for the subject is doubtless a large one. What solution, if any, have you found for the labour question? It was the Sphinx riddle of the 19th century, and when I dropped out, the Sphinx was threatening to devour society because the answer was not forthcoming. It is well worth sleeping 100 years to learn what the right answer was, if indeed you found it yet. As no such thing as a labour question is known nowadays, replied Dr. Leet, and there is no way in which it could arise, I suppose we may claim to have solved it. Society would indeed have fully deserved being devoured if it had failed to answer a riddle so entirely simple. In fact, to speak by the book, it was not necessary for society to solve the riddle at all. It may be said to have solved itself. The solution came as the result of a process of industrial evolution, which could not have terminated otherwise. All that society had to do was to recognize and cooperate with the evolution when its tendency had become unmistakable. I can only say, I answered, that at the time I fell asleep, no such evolution had been recognized. It was in 1887 that you fell asleep. I think you said. Yes, May 30th, 1887. My companion regarded me musingly for some moments. Then he observed, and you tell me that even then there was no general recognition of the nature of the crisis which society was nearing. Of course, I fully credit your statement. The singular blindness of your contemporaries to the signs of the times is a phenomenon commented on by many of our historians, but few facts of history are more difficult for us to realize. So obvious and unmistakable as we look back seem the indications, which must also have come under your eyes, of the transformation about to come to pass. I should be interested, Mr. West, if you would give me a little more definite idea of the views which you and men of your grade of intellect took on the state and prospects of society in 1887. You must at least have realized that the widespread industrial and social troubles and the underlying dissatisfaction of all classes with the inequalities of society and the general misery of mankind were portents of great change of some sort. We did indeed fully realize that, I replied. We felt that society was dragging anchor and in danger of going adrift. Whether it would drift, nobody could say, but all feared the rocks. Nevertheless, said Dr. Leet, the set of the current was perfectly perceptible if you had but taken pains to observe it, and it was not towards the rocks, but towards a deeper channel. We had a popular proverb, I replied, that hindsight is better than foresight, the force of which I shall now no doubt appreciate more fully than ever. All I can say is that the prospect was such when I went into the long sleep that I should not have been surprised had I looked down from your housetop today on a heap of charred and moss-grown ruins instead of this glorious city. Dr. Leet had listened to me with close attention and nodded thoughtfully as I finished speaking. What you have said, he observed, will be regarded as a most valuable vindication of Storiot, whose account of your era has been generally thought exaggerated in its picture of the gloom and confusion of men's minds. That a period of transition like that should be full of excitement and agitation was indeed to be looked for, but seeing how plain was the tendency of the forces in operation, it was natural to believe that hope rather than fear would have been the prevailing temper of the popular mind. You've not yet told me what was the answer to the riddle which you found, I said. I'm impatient to know by what contradiction of natural sequence the peace and prosperity which you now seem to enjoy could have been the outcome of an era like my own. Excuse me, replied my host, but do you smoke? It was not till our cigars were lighted and drawing well that he resumed. Since you are in the humour to talk rather than to sleep, as I certainly am, perhaps I cannot do better than to try to give you enough idea of our modern industrial system to dissipate at least the impression that there is any mystery about the process of its evolution. The Bostonians of your day had the reputation of being great askers of questions, and I'm going to show my dissent by asking you one to begin with. What should you name as the most prominent feature of the labour troubles of your day? Why, the strikes, of course, I replied. Exactly. But what made the strikes so formidable? The great labour organisations. And what was the motive of these great organisations? The workmen claimed they had to organise to get their rights from the big corporations, I replied. That's just it, said Dr. Leet. The organisation of labour and the strikes were just an effect merely of the concentration of capital in greater masses than had ever been known before. Before this concentration began, while as yet commerce and industry was conducted by innumerable petty concerns with small capital, instead of a small number of great concerns with vast capital, the individual workman was relatively important and independent in his relations to the employer. Moreover, when a little capital or a new idea was enough to start a man in business for himself, working men were constantly becoming employers, and there was no hard and fast line between the two classes. Labour unions were needless then, and general strikes out of the question. But when the era of small concerns with small capital was succeeded by that of great aggregations of capital, all this was changed. The individual labourer, who had been relatively important to the small employer, was reduced to insignificance and powerlessness over against the great corporation, while at the same time the way upward to the grade of employer was closed to him. Self-defence drove him to union with his fellows. The records of the period show that the outcry against the concentration of capital was furious. Men believed that it threatened society with a form of tyranny more abhorrent than they'd ever endured. They believed that the great corporations were preparing for them to yoke of a baser servitude than had ever been imposed on the race. Servitude not to men, but to soulless machines, incapable of any motive, but insatiable greed. Looking back, we cannot wonder at their desperation, for certainly humanity was never confronted with a fate more solid and hideous than would have been the era of corporate tyranny which they anticipated. Meanwhile, without being in the smallest degree checked by the clamour against it, the absorption of business by ever larger monopolies continued. In the United States, there was not, after the beginning of the last quarter of the century, any opportunity whatever for individual enterprise in any important field of industry, unless backed by a great capital. During the last decade of the century, such small businesses as still remained were fast failing survivals of a past epoch, or mere parasites on the great corporations, or else existed in fields too small to attract the great capitalists. Small businesses, as far as they still remained, were reduced to the condition of rats and mice, living in holes and corners, and counting on evading notice for the enjoyment of existence. The railroads had gone on combining till a few great syndicates controlled every rail in the land. In manufacturing, every important staple was controlled by a syndicate. These syndicates, pools, trusts, or whatever their name, fixed prices and crashed all competition, except when combinations as vast as themselves arose. Then a struggle resulting in a still greater consolidation ensued. The great city bazaar crushed its country rivals with branch stores, and in the city itself absorbed its smaller rivals, till the business of a whole quarter was concentrated under one roof, with 100 former proprietors of shops serving as clerks. Having no business of his own to put his money in, the small capitalist, at the same time that he took service under the corporation, found no other investment for his money but its stocks and bonds, thus becoming doubly dependent upon it. The fact that the desperate popular opposition to the consolidation of business in a few powerful hands had no effect to check it proves that there must have been a strong economical reason for it. The small capitalists, with their innumerable petty concerns, had in fact yielded the field to the great aggregation of capital, because they belonged to a day of small things and were totally incompetent to the demands of an age of steam and telegraph and gigantic scale of enterprises. To restore the former order of things, even if possible, would have involved returning to the day of stagecoaches. Oppressive and intolerable as was the regime of the great consolidations of capital, even its victims, while they cursed it, were forced to admit the prodigious increase of efficiency which had been imparted to the national industries, the vast economies effected by concentration of management and unity of organization, and to confess that since the new system had taken the place of the old, the wealth of the world had increased at a rate before undreamed of. To be sure, this vast increase had gone chiefly to make the rich richer, increasing the gap between them and the poor. But the fact remained that as a means merely of producing wealth, capital had been proved efficient in proportion to its consolidation. The restoration of the old system, with the subdivision of capital, if it were possible, might indeed bring back a greater equality of conditions with more individuals' dignity and freedom, but it would be at the price of general poverty and the arrest of material progress. Was there then no way of commanding the services of the mighty wealth-producing principles of consolidated capital without bowing down to plutocracy like that of Carthage? As soon as men began to ask themselves these questions, they found the answer ready for them. The movement towards the conduct of business by larger and larger aggregations of capital, the tendency towards monopolies, which had been so desperately and vainly resisted, was recognized at last in its true significance, as a process which only needed to complete its logical evolution to open a golden future to humanity. Early in the last century, the evolution was completed by the final consolidation of the entire capital of the nation, the industry and commerce of the country ceasing to be conducted by a set of irresponsible corporations and syndicates of private persons at their caprice and for their profit, was entrusted to a single syndicate representing the people, to be conducted in the common interest for the common profit. The nation, that is to say, organized as the one great business corporation in which all other corporations were absorbed. It became the one capitalist in the place of all other capitalists, the sole employer, the final monopoly in which all previous and lesser monopolies were swallowed up, a monopoly in the profits and economies of which all citizens shared. The epoch of trusts had ended in the Great Trust. In a word, the people of the United States concluded to assume the conduct of their own business, just as 100-odd years before they'd assumed the conduct of their own government, organizing now for industrial purposes on precisely the same grounds that they had then organized for political purposes. At last, strangely late in the world's history, the obvious fact was perceived that no business is so essential that public business as the industry and commerce on which the people's livelihoods depend, and that to entrust it to private persons to be managed for private profit is a folly similar in kind, though vastly greater in magnitude, to that of surrendering the function of political government to kings and nobles to be conducted for their personal glorification. Such a stupendous change as you describe, said I, did not, of course, take place without great bloodshed and terrible convulsions. On the contrary, replied Dr. Leet, there was absolutely no violence. The change had been long foreseen. Public opinion had become fully ripe for it, and whole mass of people was behind it. There was no more possibility of opposing it by force than by argument. On the other hand, the popular sentiment towards the great corporations and those identified with them had ceased to be one of bitterness, as they came to realize their necessity as a link, a transition phase in the evolution of the true industrial system. The most violent foes of the great private monopolies were now forced to recognize how invaluable and indispensable had been their office in educating the people up to the point of assuming control of their own business. 50 years before the consolidation of the industries of the country under national control would have seemed a very daring experiment to the most sanguine. But by a series of object lessons, seen and studied by all men, the great corporations had taught the people an entirely new set of ideas on the subject. They'd seen for many years syndicates handling revenues greater than those of states and directing the labours of hundreds of thousands of men with an efficiency and economy unattainable in smaller operations. It had come to be recognised as an axiom that the larger the business, the simpler the principles that can be applied to it, that as the machine is truer than the hand, so the system, which in a great concern does the work of the master's eyes, in a small business, turns out more accurate results. Thus it came about that, thanks to the corporations themselves, when it was proposed that the nation should assume their functions, the suggestion implied nothing which seemed impracticable, even to the timid. To be sure, it was a step beyond any yet taken, a broader generalization, but the very fact that the nation would be the sole corporation in the field would, it was seen, relieve the undertakings of many difficulties with which the partial monopolies had contended. Chapter 6. Dr. Leet ceased speaking, and I remained silent, endeavouring to form some general conceptions of the changes in the arrangements of society implied in the tremendous revolution which he had described. Finally, I said, the idea of such an extension of the function of government is, to say the least, rather overwhelming. Extension? He repeated. Where is the extension? In my day, I replied, it was considered that the proper functions of government, strictly speaking, were limited to keeping the peace and defending the people against the public enemy, that is, to the military and the police powers. And in heaven's name, who are the public enemies? Exclaimed Dr. Leet. Are they France, England, Germany, or hunger, cold, and nakedness? In your day, governments were accustomed, on the slightest international misunderstanding, to seize upon the bodies of citizens and deliver them over by hundreds of thousands to death and mutilation, wasting their treasures the while like water, and all this oftenest for no intangible profit to the victims. We have no wars now, and our governments no war powers. But in order to protect every citizen against hunger, cold, and nakedness, and provide for all his physical and mental needs, the function is assumed of directing his industry for a term of years. No, Mr. West, I'm sure on reflection you'll perceive that it was in your age, not in ours, that the extension of the functions of government was extraordinary. Not even for the best ends would men now allow their governments such powers as were then used for the most maleficent. Leaving comparisons aside, I said, the demagoguery and corporations of our public men would have been considered, in my day, insurpassable objections to any assumption by government of the charge of the national industries. We should have thought that no arrangement could be worse than to entrust the politicians with control of the wealth-producing machinery of the country. Its material interests were quite too much the football of parties as it was. No doubt you were right, rejoined Dr. Leet, but all that is changed now. We've no parties or politicians, and as for demagoguery and corruption, their words having only an historical significance. Human nature itself must have changed very much, I said. Not at all. was Dr. Leet's reply. But the conditions of human life have changed, and with them the motives of human action. The organisation of society with you was such that officials were under a constant temptation to misuse their powers for the private profit of themselves or others. Under such circumstances, it seems almost strange that you dared entrust them with any of your affairs. Nowadays, on the contrary, society is so constituted that there is absolutely no way in which an official, however ill-disposed, could possibly make any profit for himself or anyone else by a misuse of his power. Let him be as bad an official as you please, he cannot be a corrupt one. There is no motive to be. The social system no longer offers a premium on dishonesty. But these are matters which you can only understand as you come with time to know us better. But you've not yet told me how you have settled the labour problem. It is the problem of capital which we've been discussing, I said. After the nation had assumed conduct of the mills, machinery, railroads, farm, mines, and capital in general of the country, the labour question still remained. In assuming the responsibilities of capital, the nation had assumed the difficulties of the capitalist's position. The moment the nation assumed the responsibilities of capital, those difficulties vanished, replied Dr. Leet. The national organisation of labour under one direction, which was, in your day and under your system, justly regarded as the insoluble labour problem. When the nation became the sole employer, all the citizens, by virtue of their citizenship, became employees, to be distributed according to the needs of industry. That is, I suggested, you have simply applied the principle of universal military service, as it was understood in our day, to the labour question. Yes, said Dr. Leet. That was something which followed as a matter of course. As soon as the nation had become the sole capitalist, the people were already accustomed to the idea that the obligation of every citizen, not physically disabled, to contribute his military service to the defence of the nation was equal and absolute, that it was equally the duty of every citizen to contribute his quota of industrial or intellectual service to the maintenance of the nation was equally evident, though it was not until the nation became the employer of labour that citizens were able to render this sort of service. With any pretence, either of university or equity, no organisation of labour was possible when the employing power was divided among hundreds or thousands of individuals and corporations, between which concert of any kind was neither desired nor indeed feasible. It constantly happened, then, that vast numbers who desired to labour could find no opportunities. On the other hand, those who desired to evade a part or all of their debt could easily do so. Service now, I suppose, is compulsory upon all, I suggested. It is rather a matter of course than of compulsion, replied Dr. Leet. It is regarded as so absolutely natural and reasonable that the idea of it being compulsory has ceased to be thought of. He would be thought to be an incredibly contemptible person who should need compulsion in such a case. Nevertheless, to speak of serving being compulsory would be a weak way to state its absolute inevitableness. Our entire social order is so wholly based upon and deduced from it that, if it were conceivable that a man could escape it, he would be left with no possible way to provide for his existence. He would have excluded himself from the world, cut himself off from his kind, in a word, committed suicide. Is the term of service in this industrial army for life? Oh no, it's both. Begins later and ends earlier than the average working period in your day. Your workshops were filled with children and old men, but we hold the period of youth sacred to education and the period of maturity, when the physical forces begin to flag, equally sacred to ease and agreeable relaxation. The period of industrial service is 24 years, beginning at the close of the course of education at 21 and terminating at 45. After 45, while discharged from labour, the citizen still remains liable to special calls in cases of emergencies causing a sudden great increase in demand for labour, till he reaches the age of 55. But such calls are rarely, in fact almost never, made. The 15th day of October of every year is what we call muster day, because those who've reached the age of 21 are then mustered into the industrial service, and at the same time, those after 24 years' service have reached the age of 45 are honourably mustered out. It is the great day of the year with us, whence we reckon all other events, our Olympiad, save that it is annual. Chapter 7. It is after you've mustered your industrial army into service, I said, that I should expect the chief difficulty to arise, for there its analogy with a military army must cease. Soldiers have all the same thing, and a very simple thing to do, namely to practice the manual of arms, to march and stand guard. But the industrial army must learn and follow 200 or 300 diverse trades and avocations. What administrative talent can be equal to determining wisely what trade or business every individual in a great nation shall pursue? The administration has nothing to do with determining that point. Who does determine it then? I asked. Every man for himself, in accordance with his natural aptitudes, the utmost pains being taken to enable him to find out what his natural aptitude really is. The principle on which our industrial army is organised is that a man's natural endowments, mental and physical, determine what he can work at most profitably to the nation and most satisfactorily to himself, while the obligation of service is in some form is not to be evaded. Voluntary election, subject only to necessary regulation, is depended on to determine the particular sort of service every man is to render. As an individual's satisfaction during his term of service depends on his having an occupation to his taste, parents and teachers watch from early years for indications of special aptitudes in children, and thorough study of the national industrial system with the history and the rudiments of all the great trades is an essential part of our education system. While manual training is not allowed to encroach on the general intellectual culture to which our schools are devoted, it is carried far enough to give our youths, in addition to their theoretical knowledge of the national industries, mechanical and agricultural, a certain familiarity with their tools and methods. Our schools are constantly visiting our workshops, and often are taking on long excursions to inspect particular industrial enterprises. In your day, a man was not ashamed to be grossly ignorant of all trades, except his own, but such ignorance would not be consistent with our ideas of placing everyone in a position to select intelligently the occupations for which he has most taste. Usually, long before he is mustered into service, a young man has found out the pursuit he wants to follow, has acquired a great deal of knowledge about it, and is waiting impatiently the time when he can enlist in its ranks. Surely, I said, it can hardly be that the number of volunteers for any trade is exactly the number needed for that trade. It must be generally either under or over the demand. The supply of volunteers is always expected to fully equal the demand, replied Dr. Leet. It is the business of the administration to see that this is the case. The rate of volunteering for each trade is closely watched. If there be a noticeably greater excess of volunteers over men needed in any trade, it is inferred that the trade offers greater attraction than others. On the other hand, if the number of volunteers for a trade tends to drop below the demand, it is inferred that it is thought more arduous. It is the business of the administrators to seek constantly to equalize the attractions of the trades, so that, so far as the conditions of labour in them are concerned, so that all trades shall be equally attractive to persons having natural tastes for them. This is done by making the hours of labour in different trades to differ according to their arduousness. The lighter trades, prosecuted under the most agreeable circumstances, have in this way the longest hours, while the arduous trades, such as mining, have very short hours. There is no theory, no rule by which the respective attractiveness of industries is determined. The administration, in taking burdens off one class of workers and adding them to other classes, simply follows the fluctuations of opinions among the workers themselves, as indicated by the rate of volunteering. The principle is that no man's work ought to be, on the whole, harder for him than any other man's for him, the workers themselves to be the judges. There are no limits to the application of this rule. If any particular occupation is in itself so arduous or so oppressive that in order to induce volunteers the day's work in it had to be replaced to 10 minutes, it would be done. If even then no man was willing to do it, it would remain undone. But of course, in positive fact, a moderate reduction in the hours of labour, or addition of other privileges, suffices to secure all needed volunteers for any occupation necessary to men. If indeed the unavoidable difficulties and dangers of such a necessary pursuit were so great that no inducement of compensating advantages would overcome men's repugnance to it, the administration would only need to take it out of the common order of occupations by declaring it extra hazardous, and those who pursued it especially worthy of the national gratitude to be overrun with volunteers. Our young men are very greedy of honour, and do not let slip such opportunities. Of course, you'll see that dependence on the purely voluntary choice of avocations involves the abolition in all of anything like unhygiene conditions or special peril to life and limb. Health and safety are conditions common to all industries. The nation does not maim and slaughter its workmen by thousands, as did the private capitalists and corporations of your day. When there are more who want to enter a particular trade than there is room for, how do you decide between the applicants? I inquired. Preference is given to those who have acquired the most knowledge of the trade they wish to follow. No man, however, who through successive years remains persistent in his desire to show what he can do at any particular trade, is in the end denied an opportunity. Meanwhile, if a man cannot at first win entrance into a business he prefers, he has usually one or more alternative preferences, pursuits for which he has some degree of aptitude, although not the highest. Everyone, indeed, is expected to study his aptitude so as to have not only a first choice as to occupation, but a second or third, so that if either at the outset of his career or subsequently, owing to the progress of invention or changes in demand, he is unable to follow his first vocation, he can still find reasonably congenial employment. This principle of secondary choice as occupation is quite important in our system. I should add, in reference to the counter possibility of some sudden failure of volunteers in the particular trade, or some sudden necessity of an increased force, that the administration, while depending on the voluntary system for filling up the trades as a rule, holds always in reserve the power to call for special volunteers or draft any force needed from any quarter. Generally, however, all needs of this sort can be met by details from the class of unskilled or common labourers. How is this class of common labourers recruited? I asked. Surely nobody voluntarily enters that. It is the grade to which all new recruits belong for the first 3 years of their service. It is not till after this period, during which he is assignable to any work at the discretion of his superiors, that the young man is allowed to elect a special avocation. These 3 years of stringent discipline none are exempt from, and very glad our young men are to pass from the severe school into a comparative liberty of the trades. If a man were so stupid as to have no choice as to occupation, he would simply remain a common labourer, but such cases, as you may suppose, are not common. Having once elected and entered on a trade or occupation, I remarked, I suppose he has to stick to that for the rest of his life. Not necessarily, replied Dr. Leet. While frequent and merely capricious changes of occupation are not encouraged or even permitted, every worker is allowed, of course, under certain regulations and in accordance with the exigencies of the service, to volunteer for another industry which he thinks would suit him better than his first choice. In this case, his application is received just as if he were volunteering for the first time, and on the same terms. Not only this, but a worker may likewise, under suitable regulations and not too frequently, obtain a transfer to an establishment of the same industry in another part of the country, which for any reason he may prefer. Under your system, a discontented man could indeed leave his work at will, but he left his means of support at the same time, and took his chances as to the future livelihood. We find that the number of men who wish to abandon an accustomed occupation for a new one, and old friends and associations for strange ones, is small. It's only the poorer sort of workmen who desire to change even as frequently as our regulations permit. Of course, transfers or discharges, when health demands them, are always given. As an industrial system, I should think this might be extremely efficient, I said, but I don't see that it makes any provision for the professional classes, the men who serve the nation with brains instead of hands. Of course, you can't get along without the brain workers. How then are they selected from those who serve as farmers and mechanics? That must require a very delicate sort of sifting process, I should say. So it does, replied Dr. Leet. The most delicate possible test is needed here, and so we leave the question whether a man shall be a brain or hand worker entirely to him to settle. At the end of the term of 3 years as a common labourer, which every man must serve, it is for him to choose, in accordance to his natural tastes, whether he will fit himself for an art or profession, or be a farmer or mechanic. If he feels that he can do better work with his brains than his muscles, he finds every facility provided for testing the reality of his supposed bent of cultivating it, and if fit of pursuing it as his avocation. The schools of technology, of medicine, of art, of music, of histrionics, and of higher liberal learning are always open to aspirants without condition. Are not the schools flooded with young men whose only motive is to avoid work? Dr. Leet smiled a little grimly. No one is at all likely to enter the professional schools for the purpose of avoiding work, I assure you, he said. There are intended for those with special aptitudes for the branches they teach, and anyone without it would find it easier to do double hours as his trade than try to keep up with the classes. Of course, many honestly mistake their vocation, and finding themselves unequal to do the requirements of the school, drop out.